Thank you very much for the introduction, Martin, and thank you all for being here to hear this. What I wanted to do with our last part of the session this morning is to talk a little bit with you about how to get a paper published. I think we should always start these talks by saying a few things about what our potential conflicts of interest are, and I would say right up front, as you've already been told, I'm the editor-in-chief of Vox Sanguinis, so I have vested self-interest in this talk, which I guess is a declared conflict. I would like to see the best papers possible submitted to our society's journal. Now, what I'm going to do is talk generally about the publication of papers and not be specific about publication in Vox, because I think that people publish in many different journals, and what I would like to communicate to you this morning are some expectations and some of the pitfalls and the tricks of the trade that you can use for publishing widely in all sorts of formats. I've put up here on this slide some examples of the kinds of communications that we use in science. Original articles are really going to be the focus of what I'm going to talk about today, and they come in different kinds of forms. They may be a full-length manuscript, a large manuscript, or they could be shorter communications, case reports. They may be things that are more like survey summaries, things like the International Forum that we publish in Vox Sanguinis. They may actually be meeting reports. There are also review articles. We're all very familiar with those. It's a very good way to catch up on literature. And then there's the letter to the editor, which some journals publish, but not all journals do. They're usually used to communicate some piece of information relating to other publications that have appeared in the journal, but not necessarily restricted to that. Okay, so what do we want to do when we think about how to write good papers? The first thing we want to think about is that there's pre-work that we need to do before we ever put fingers on a keyboard or pen on a piece of paper. And the most important piece of advice I'll give you, I think, in this talk is really something that is a habit that you need to acquire, and that's about learning by observation. It's about when you sit down to read in the literature, to acquire that knowledge that Dr. Coe was talking about in his first talk. Think to yourself as you're reading, what made this a really good paper, or what made this a really not very good paper? What are the elements of a paper that made it understandable for me to read, that made it interesting, that made it flow in a way that was logical? What did those writers do when they put that paper together? And think about that when you're reading. And just as well, you look at, why did I read that paper and it really took me far too long to read it. I was annoyed while I was reading it, and I don't believe what they said anyway. So what are the negative lessons you take from reading? It also helps to pay attention to the kind of data that are in a paper, how much data are there, and in a paper that you've decided is good, and think about how it flows as the story is being told by the authors of that paper. So this is something we can all do as we're just reading through the literature, to be aware of what the difference is between a good paper and a bad paper when you are the consumer of that paper. But let's go on now to say, okay, we're going to start thinking about publishing our own papers. Well, as Dr. Coe has told you, it all starts with an idea. And that idea and the way we establish investigating the idea has a lot to do with what we call the project design. And this is really where we need to start. So good papers all arise out of well-designed studies. It is extremely difficult to take a poorly designed study and turn it into a good paper. And in fact, I would argue that it's virtually impossible. You need to think about things in the design that relate to, do you need control groups for your experiment? Do you have appropriate statistical analysis? You need to think about this up front. As good as statisticians are, they can rarely rescue something that was flawed in its design from the beginning. So you need to talk to your statistical assistants at the beginning of your idea, not after you've already carried out the study. You need to consider what kind of analytical methods you're using to answer the question. Are they the sort of current state-of-the-art methods in the field? Are they giving you information that is thought to be credible information in the sort of modern time that you're doing the experiment in? As far as the paper writing is concerned, it's right here at the beginning where you should start thinking about writing the paper. You should first of all think of what might you call the paper? What's a provisional title for that paper? it sort of starts to makes you crystallize your thoughts a bit. You should at that point in time create an outline for what that paper might look like. And by an outline, I mean, what does figure 1 look like? What does table 2 look like? And that mapping that out will help you design the experiments that you need to do to populate those figures and tables. You should be thinking very early on about where you might be trying to publish a paper. And this is actually quite a difficult question for someone who's starting to write. And so you need to be working at it as you're completing your project. You should be getting some ideas by looking at the journals that you were using to gather the knowledge when you started to design the study, so that you could try to look at where are similar studies in this area published. What are the list of journals that would be appropriate to send your paper to? You might want to think about questions like, is your paper of broad general interest? In other words, is this a paper that might go to the New England Journal of Medicine, or should it be targeted to a more specific audience, other colleagues who focus in transfusion medicine? You want to go to the website of the small number of journals you may think are appropriate for your paper and read what the mandate is of the journal. So what is the journal trying to achieve? What kinds of forms of science is the journal focused on? And really think about, does that line up with the work that you're trying to publish? You'll also, at that journal's website, find the guidance that the journal wants to give to potential authors, the instructions, the directions. You heard a lot from Dr. Daniels about the importance of following the directions. The first step is read the directions. It's very good to decide what your target journal is before you write the paper, because the whole thing will flow much more easily. It's very frustrating to write an entire paper and then get to the end and go to submit it and realize that you've got it in the wrong format and the references should have been put into the text instead of numbered, or the reference format is wrong, and then you have another whole day of undoing what you've already done. So it's always better to find out up front. Most biomedical journal articles are laid out in what we call the IMRAD format. So we're all used to this from reading. We start with an introduction, then we provide the methods that we used to do the study, we provide the results, and then we provide a discussion. Almost all journals also require an abstract. This is not quite the same abstract as the abstract that Dr. Daniels just walked you through, and we'll talk more about that. So again, I'm saying this another time because I really want, this is the take-home lesson, read the instructions. Every journal wants something slightly different. There is no standard format, there's no international SOP for journal operation. Everybody has their own little twists and their own favorite flavor of something, so you need to figure out what that is before you start writing that paper. What happens if you don't pay any attention to that? Well, if you don't pay attention to the rules and you send your paper to Vox Sanguinis, the assistant for the journal goes through a technical review of every paper that gets submitted, and if you haven't followed the rules, you get an immediate technical rejection of your paper. You might as well have put it in a rubber envelope because it's going to bounce right back to you for not having followed the rules. You're given an opportunity, obviously, to resubmit your paper with the rules followed correctly, but this almost always results in a delay in the review process, which was completely unnecessary if you just sit down and look at what the journal requires before you submit the paper. The two of the more common reasons for a technical rejection of papers are word limits. Many journals have word limits. Vox Sanguinis has a word limit. When you want to be able to count up the words for your paper, and it helps to just state the number of words right on the cover, on the first page of the article. And when you count those words, you should just count up all of them unless the journal instruction tells you something different. So if the journal instruction says, here's your word maximum except references, you don't need to count the words in the references. Other journals want you to count all the words. So again, read the instructions. And the reference formatting is important. There's software packages that will automatically format your references correctly for particular journals, but if you don't happen to have your information kept in that kind of referencing software, then you'll need to pay careful attention to the format of the references as you go. So those are sort of the basic principles you want. Now you want to get into the business of actually providing your scientific paper for your peers to be able to review, read, and enjoy. This really is all about storytelling. And it's quite straightforward. you want to be able to tell the why. Why did you put all this effort and energy into this project? How did you do it? How did you try to answer the question that you were seeking to answer? What? What did you find? And then very importantly, who cares? Why does the scientific community need to know about this study that you did? So those are the 4 questions to bear in mind as you start writing. I'm going to come back and talk a bit about the abstract. I'm going to give you the recommendation that you actually write the abstract last, after you've finished writing all of the rest of the paper. Because the abstract needs to be a very concise articulation of the paper that you wrote. And if you haven't written the paper yet, you can't possibly write the correct abstract. So write the paper first and come back and write the abstract later. As Dr. Daniels indicated, the abstract is actually really very important because it's often the only thing besides the title that a reader of your paper will take a look at. So it may be your only opportunity to catch the attention of that reader. The format of your abstract is often very specific to the journal that you're submitting to, so again, read the instructions. In an abstract, you want to set the stage. You want to give that why in 2 or 3 sentences that really catch the reader to understand why is this an important topic and why should I keep reading? Why should I, instead of just looking at the quick abstract, why should I call up the paper out of my university's library and read the whole paper? You want to, in your abstract, provide a very brief description of the methodology. You want to summarize the results with the data included, and you want to state the conclusions. This is a tough task because you often have only 250 words in which to do this. So writing a good abstract is actually really quite a challenge when it comes to putting a paper together. But what about the other parts of the paper? Well, there's the introduction. You want to provide the relevant background to your story. Don't write a complete literature review and insert it in your introduction. You only want to cite the specific literature that the reader needs to know about to understand how you set the stage for the scientific story that you're trying to tell. Generally, at the end of an introduction, there's a very brief description of the aims and the rationale of your study, and usually a 1 sentence that just describes what the conclusion was, what you found in your paper. It's a sort of fairly traditional way to end an introduction with a paragraph at the end. One then needs to go on to the methods. This section is where somebody who is reading your paper should be able to acquire enough information that they could repeat your study doing it exactly the way that you did it. So you don't have to be able to write it in a way that your second cousin twice removed who is an accountant needs to know, but for another scientist, you're writing for another scientist to provide them with information that they could use to repeat your study. It's perfectly okay in the methods to cite other papers that describe the method in more detail. So something was done according to the method of Smith et al. You cite the reference, it's in your reference list. You don't need to provide a whole paragraph, yet again repeating what's already published in the Smith paper, as long as you did it the same way. But if you took 2 of the buffers in the Smith paper and changed the pH, then you should tell your readership that that's what you did. The methods section also contains the details of the statistics and the data handling that you did. And you'll often, that's a very common thing that comes back from reviewers, insufficient statistical analysis detail provided. So you need to think about that more up front. If you're writing to report on clinical studies, there are often guidelines that are used for how to report clinical studies, and I've listed 3 of them here. You can find them well reported by just Googling Consort or Prisma or Strobe. We then go on to the results section. It's important in your results to be clear. You have to be able to really tell your story clearly at this point. You want to put real data, real analysis, numbers, statistics, and the detailed findings of whatever it was you did. You always want to make sure that what you've got in tables and figures matches up with what you wrote in the text. You'd be surprised how often this happens, that what's in your table is not the same thing that you've written in the paragraphs in the results section. You want to avoid exaggeration of your results, and you want to avoid repeating things over and over again, so you need to be careful about that. Don't create a table or a figure for something that could simply be said in 1 sentence. So journals are always paying attention to how much space your story takes up, so you want to try to be as concise as possible. If you're going to make tables and figures, you need to think about what the journal that you're submitting your paper to does with a table or figure. So go look in a copy of it and see if they shrink your figure down to something that's 1 column width and a 2 columns per page type journal. You need to think in advance of what that figure is going to look like when you shrink it down. If you use very small font for labeling things within the figure, when it gets shrunk down, nobody's going to be able to read what's in it. So you need to think about that beforehand. You also need to make sure that you've defined all the abbreviations and legends or footnotes, because each table or each figure should essentially be freestanding. You then go on to the discussion. You want to talk about what the results are saying. You want to make sure that you put in the discussion, what is the message you want the reader to take away? What's the message in the bottle from your project? You need to be careful not to give more importance to your findings than they deserve. We are often proud parents of our science, and we need to be really careful not to be promoting our children in a way where it's not appropriate. We also want to minimize any speculation if you don't actually have data that support the speculation. So you don't want to say, well, you know, this particular finding of mine has greater significance for the following sets of scenarios when you've got absolutely no data to support that statement. So be careful of that. I'd like to say a word about authorship. This is often a very contentious area that the reviewer and the editor of the journal know nothing about, but you certainly go through it on the front end. Deciding authorship comes with a set of rules. So the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors has actually set a series of criteria. And these state that the authors have to do the following. An author has to have made substantial contribution to the conception or design of the work. So this means that the guy down the hall who let you use his centrifuge does not qualify for authorship. An author also has to have been involved in writing the paper, drafting the work, and revising it. All of the authors have to provide final approval of the version that went to the editor, and very importantly, all authors need to be willing to be accountable for the entire contents of that paper. So if you're going to be an author, you have to meet all 4 of these criteria. So this is an easy test of authorship. If you don't meet all 4 of this criteria, and you still want to recognize the contribution of someone to the work, that's why we have an acknowledgement section in papers. In addition, in that acknowledgement section, many journals now require that you, the authors, explain what the contribution of each of the authors was to the paper. So if you look in papers now, you'll see in the acknowledgement section, usually written by the initials of the authors, so-and-so conceived the study, so-and-so executed the experiments, all authors were involved in the writing and editing of the paper, or something like that. So that's what you need to do. What do you need to not do? What are some of the pitfalls that we see of writing manuscripts? The big one, in my opinion, is just lack of organization. We see manuscripts frequently that just haven't had enough attention paid to the detail and how they're structured. Any paper that you submit should be neat. I mean, I know I'm sounding like your mother, right? But it should be neat. It should be clear in meaning, and it should be free from errors. You don't want to annoy the reviewer of your paper by having it full of typographical errors. The alignment is wrong in the paragraphs. Just all the little details are not quite right. You want to make sure you define all the abbreviations. If you haven't done that, it's sometimes very difficult to interpret. You want to be careful not to use too much jargon. That's your sort of local language for some part of a study. And please number the pages. You'd be surprised how many times people print out pages without numbers, and then they fall out of the printer and drop on the floor, and you spend 20 minutes trying to figure out which one went with where. Another writing pitfall, and I've said this about 4 times already, is failure to comply with the requirements of the journal. So this is the automatic technical reject. It's far more common than I would like to see it. I mean, there are some weeks when it is, or some months, I should say, when as many as 20% of the papers submitted to Vox get technical rejects. That means that the authorship, the people submitting are not reading the directions. And then this was also mentioned by Dr. Daniels. One of the pitfalls that all journals see, no matter whether you're publishing in English or you're publishing in another language, is poor use of the language in which the journal is published. So if don't have German as my first language, but if I need to write an abstract for the publication of the German journals, I should have that read by a native German speaker to check that my German is actually correct. I'm sure it won't be, so that I need that help. Similarly, if English is not your first language, get someone who has English as a first language to just read through your paper to make sure that it makes sense. One of the other things I just want to raise, because I think I have seen people who get caught in this trap really quite innocently, has to do with what the journal does with your paper after you've published it, just to make sure that you have given correct attribution to the work of others. So there has been some people who have misunderstood that you don't just copy word for word out of other people's articles without citing them. That's plagiarism. You can copy something out of another article with quotation marks and cite the reference from which you took it. Journals now, most journals, use anti-plagiarism software. So when we get a paper, we put it through a program that checks to see whether this has appeared anywhere else. Even Google is very good at that. If you take a sentence out of one of your own publications and type it into Google, Google will find your paper. So do pay some attention to the original writing that you call your own. You then want to submit the paper. Most journals have an online submission process. It's really helpful if you sign up for that when you first start writing the paper, because you'll see what the journal is going to want out of you. Most journals are asking for preferred referees. These are people that should not be your mother, and it should not be the person in the lab next door. You want to get people who you know are credible in the field in which you're publishing. Many journals also give you an opportunity to write down the names of people that you don't want to review your paper. We do realize that some people have long-standing disagreements, shall we say, with other people, and you may not want that person reviewing your work. You need to include a cover letter that has two important statements in it. One is that the paper is not currently under review anywhere else, and that it has not been previously published. And then second statement that needs to be in there is that all authors have read and approved the manuscript as submitted. So that last final one that goes to the journal really has to be seen, read, and approved by all of the authors. Then what happens to your paper? You get a decision from the journal. It might get rejected. Rejections are sometimes very useful because they will come with reasons why your paper got rejected. Perhaps you sent it to the wrong journal. Perhaps your paper wasn't sufficiently novel for the journal. Perhaps your paper had fatal flaws in its design. You also might get a response back that says it's possibly okay to be accepted, in which case you need to really carefully address each of the comments of the reviewers. And do this as best you can. Rebuttal, in other words, writing back saying, the reviewer wants this, but he's all wrong. The reviewer wants that. They don't know what they're talking about. Those are not helpful responses to reviewers. Please don't take the comments of reviewers personally. They really are trying to help you make a better paper and to help you improve your study. And the other thing about the reviews is sometimes you'll get reviewers who give you contradictory recommendations. So not all reviewers will agree. And sometimes not all reviewers will even give the editor the same recommendations. So you might get a reviewer who says to reject a paper while another reviewer says, just tell them to fix up the discussion and it's okay to publish. In that case, the editor usually will go out for a third review. This is one of the reasons why sometimes it takes a bit longer to get papers reviewed than we all think that we might want to. So I'm going to take 2 more minutes and close on one topic that I think we all need to start doing a little bit more thinking about. And that relates to how the whole field of academic publishing is changing very fast. I'll give you the sort of backline story behind this is really come much more into the public media through the work of an investigator who was working for Science magazine, which published in October of this year a really interesting and scary study where this individual wrote a fake paper. He had a fictional author from a fictional institution with a very badly flawed study with bad data analysis, a set of chemicals. It was a cancer drug study, and it had impossible chemistry in it. So this was full of errors. He then sent it to 304 open access journals, and more than half of these journals accepted it, most of it not even reviewed. So as a scientific community, we need to be thinking very hard about how we operate open access. This study got obviously a lot of attention amongst the scientific community, published in Nature, but then started to get picked up by the public media, hit the cover of The Economist, who also had a very interesting article in there. So this is an Economist from last month. I would encourage everybody to take a look at it. You can get the information online. So this really relates to the quality and the rise of new journals. And you need to bear this in mind when you're thinking about where you're going to publish. Open access is an excellent concept, but we don't quite have it right how we're going to use open access. Open access journals normally are charging fees to the authors rather than asking for subscriptions for people to sign up to receiving the journal. I think that it's safe to say that some, and perhaps most, open access journals need to be looked at very carefully if you're thinking about using them for publishing your work. Many of them fail the basic tests of scholarly integrity. There's inappropriate peer review as a minimum. If you have a journal that you're looking at, that you're thinking you might want to send your paper to, and it's open access, and you're not sure whether it's a good one or a bad one, I would direct you to a very useful resource, which is called Beall's List of Predatory Publishers and Predatory Journals. Dr. Beall is a professor at the University of Colorado in Denver in library sciences, and he's taken sort of a personal mission to go look through all of the details of these various open access journals against a set of standard criteria for whether they're a good one or not a good one. His list in 2011 had 23 publishers on it. His list in 2012 had 225 publishers on it. So this is a growing problem, not a shrinking problem, and just one that we all need to be aware about, because there's nothing worse than having your hard work for doing your study, your hard work writing your paper, going into a journal, which is then going to get dismissed by your peers because it was the wrong kind of journal to publish in. So I'll stop there. I know there were a few minutes working into the lunchtime here, but just would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. And thank you for your attention.